That's what this is all about, is to fight for the control of the water.
The water crisis in the scenic Klamath Basin has raged on for 100 years and counting.
Just about everything that can go wrong with Western water law has gone wrong in the Klamath.
As a power company, we are not in the business of removing dams. We are in the business of generating power.
You can't be a Karuk without salmon.
Sometimes the right decision isn't always a popular decision.
Can an historic compromise restore peace, fish, and clean water to this vast river community? Stay with us for a special presentation of the Klamath Basin, a restoration for the ages. Hello, I'm Frances Fisher. I'm standing above the Iron Gate Dam, one of several hydroelectric dams along the Klamath River. Now, the disputes about this river are epic, but that's changing as area fishermen, farmers, tribes, environmental groups, and the power company that owns this dam are coming together to craft what many believe will be a lasting peace to the watershed. But before we get to that, let's listen to a little history. The Klamath Basin along the California-Oregon border gets its name from the Native American word Klamath, which means swiftness. The basin lays claim to majestic beauty and abundance of natural resources and more Bigfoot sightings than just about anywhere else in the country. But the crown jewel of the watershed does indeed exemplify effortless speed. The Klamath River is so swift, in fact, that early entrepreneurs envisioned harnessing her momentum to create power.
The Klamath Basin is a relatively isolated area. It's far from the power centers of both Sacramento and Salem, and it's an area that's relatively lightly settled up until the early 20th century.
But even before early settlers arrived, an ancient people known as the Klamath tribes thrived in this region for centuries.
The river starts here in our homeland. All of the rivers, they all flow down eventually into Klamath Lake here, and Klamath Lake is where Klamath River starts. Salmon's been here since we've been here. You know, the Creator placed salmon here, and it was put here for the subsistence of our people. We've always harvested that fish from these rivers here. It's our most important resource that we have is fish, and it's the reason I'm standing here today. If it wasn't for fish, if it wasn't for salmon, if it wasn't for chawam, I wouldn't be here today. My people wouldn't have survived here.
In the early 1900s, the Secretary of the Interior authorized a federal water project in the basin. This act would give rise to a promising new industry across the West: irrigated agriculture.
The Klamath Reclamation Project was authorized by Congress in 1905, and development began at that point. Part of the settlement of the West is to develop farmlands.
In 1946, this spinning pickle jar whirled the hopes and aspirations of 1,300 veterans of World War II. The place is Klamath Falls, Oregon, where former servicemen and their families tensely wait as a drawing is held for the first public land grant since the war ended. The first number is called.
There's a lot of land is drained, several 100,000 acres are available for farming, and that really changes the ecosystem, really changes the flow of water. In addition to the irrigation dams that were placed in the upper basin, in between the 1920s and the 1950s, there were a series of hydropower dams put in, and those also very much changed the flow of the river.
They needed cheap power. They needed power to fuel the industrialization of the Northwest. And the predecessor companies that that built these dams were adhering and following the lead of the two states and the federal government in building these dams.
This is the story of the 4 hydroelectric dams along the Klamath River, built not for irrigating thirsty crops, not for containing floodwaters, but for generating electricity needed by the growing population. Collectively, The dams produce enough electricity to power roughly 70,000 households. PacifiCorp, one of the West's leading utilities, owns the dams. Dean Brockbank is vice president.
J.C. Boyle here is the dam that we're standing in front of, and this is the dam that's the northernmost on the Klamath River, at least that generates power. And it is also the largest as far as the power generator. It generates about 98 megawatts of nameplate power. Going downstream, then we have Copco number 1, which is the oldest dam, and it's about 20 megawatts of power. And it's also the oldest, and it's also the largest. If you've seen it, it's huge, and it's a lot of concrete. The purpose of that largely is to generate power. And very close to Copco number 1 is Copco number 2, which ironically it generates more power than Copco number 1, and it's a very small dam. It's about 28 megawatts of power. Continuing down the river, you have the furthest down closest to the ocean, and that is the Iron Gate facility. And that is also the dam where, just on the downstream side of the dam, where we have our hatchery, where we fund the hatchery, the power company funds it, and California Fish and Game operates it. It's a very successful hatchery.
Today, the hatchery helps offset the consequences of a decision made by the original dam builders to not install a fish ladder for migratory fish.
Well, let's look at what the dams have done to the river. First off, they've blocked salmon access to a third of the river. Most of the headwaters of that river, salmon can't get there. They're stuck in the lower and middle river, where habitat isn't as useful. The dams have blocked sediment and gravel recruitment for some 50 miles downriver. The salmon spawning and rearing gravel that they need to lay their eggs is pretty much deficient.
Experts cite an 85% decline in historic salmon populations in the Klamath. Loss of habitat, poor water quality, overfishing, and water withdrawals are contributing factors of this considerable drop. But the long-term ramifications are perhaps best seen in the native people who've lived on the river's bounty for centuries.
We're talking just a microsecond in time when these fish have flourished here for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and all of a sudden all of this change has occurred in the last 120 years. Dams have been built, communities, other populations have moved in, and all of that's had a huge effect on the environment, and it's changed water, it's changed water quality, and ultimately it's changed it to the point where fish can't survive at times.
When there's a rapid transition to a Western diet from a native diet, there's health problems associated with that. And so for Karuk, who have really seen this rapid transition, especially since Iron Gate Dam was built and spring salmon, the run of spring salmon has really gone away, Karuks have a higher incidence of heart disease, of diabetes, obesity, and other diet-related illnesses. They experience these illnesses at a much higher rate than their non-native counterparts living in the same community.
You boys ready?
Yeah.
All right. We'll pack them out. So traditionally I was taught that before you go on a trail, because everything's living, everything's a part of you, you're connected spiritually and physically to everything around you, that you pray before you go on a trail. Today, and I asked the trail for permission to go down, and please take care of my friends that I'm bringing down with me and my little brothers and Matt, for we have all good intentions today. Walk, Claw, walk, Claw, walk, Claw. All right, boys ready?
Yeah.
Grab your shorts.
17-year-old Sammy Jensaw is a Yurok Indian.
And the rules are, before you come down and you go eeling, you gotta learn how to build a fire.
At the mouth of the Klamath River, he's teaching his brothers, Peter and Luke, how to fish for eel, which, like salmon, used to be an important, abundant part of the Yurok diet.
Remember, you respect everything, okay? You even got respect for the water, because this ocean's so powerful, it can just take you out. That's why you respect it, and it's giving us something that we feed our families. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna go in, you're gonna dip, and you're gonna scrape up, and you're gonna hook that eel like that. And once it's on your hook, you're gonna swing it. And what that does, the sheer force of that keeps it on the hook itself. Right now, this is like perfect conditions for eeling. It doesn't matter as long as there's no eels to catch, you know? That's where the real problem lies, is what's going on up the river affects us down here. We're tied to everything. Everything affects us. Whether it's a feather drop, sand on the beach, every little thing. The dams especially affect us for quality and water, and this is a sad thing to see, but it's all ammunition to fight harder for cleaner water. That's just how I look at it. Because one day, the eels will come back and we will have righteous runs again.
Historically, the Klamath is considered the second most productive salmon river south of the Columbia, behind only the Great Sacramento San Joaquin system. Archaeological evidence indicates that before the dams were built, Chinook lived in several tributaries of the upper basin, and populations of coho traveled upstream of J.C. Boyle. But by the mid-1930s, the declining runs of salmon, along with legislative bans, brought about the closure of fisheries, canneries, and sports fishing ventures on the river. Today, amid new allocation standards and harvest restrictions, the commercial ocean salmon fishing industry has managed to stay afloat, but not without significant economic loss.
What it's meant to us is huge job losses. A lot of the boats are gone. There used to be twice or three times as many salmon boats as we see right now. Most of those are gone. We really need to bring this resource back because it means jobs, it means dollars for our communities, it means economic survival for a lot of small fishing-dependent towns up and down the coast.
Fishing is what I do. It's my sustenance in every way.
Dave Bitts is a salmon fisherman in the summertime and a crab fisherman in the winter.
First of all, we're hoping for a fairly calm ocean. That would be a good thing. We're kind of a subculture in a way. There's no such thing as Monday through Friday. There's no such thing as 9 to 5. There's no health insurance. There's no retirement benefits. But as an ocean salmon fisherman, my life is to a large extent governed by the abundance of fish coming out of the Klamath River. So we'd like to see a lot of fish coming out of that river on a consistent basis, because that means more fishing opportunity for us. And fish all up and down the river have to cope with this greatly reduced water quality. Dam removal for me is a water quality issue. We're never going to have water quality suitable for regular sustained production of salmon in that river as long as those dams are in place. We represent something. The fact, if you have a fleet of boats engaged in salmon fishing and you see those boats coming and going, you can find the fish in the market. That's telling you that we haven't yet screwed it up so badly that we're all in dire trouble. If we don't pay attention to what's going on around us, we wind up with a future in which all we got is soybeans and people.
Water quality issues in the phosphorus-rich upper basin were present long before the settlers arrived. Phosphorus feeds algae, which ultimately supports the food chain. Settlement brought roads, logging, livestock, and irrigated agriculture, all activities that increased the flow of phosphorus into the river. But too much can spike toxins and choke off the oxygen fish need to survive.
They've elevated the temperature by creating warm water reservoirs. That has caused huge toxic algae blooms, which are poisoning the fish and poisoning the river. Every year now, there are big signs all along the river and in the lake saying, don't come in contact with the water. Well, the fish don't have that option.
The passage of the Endangered Species Act of 1973 mandated the protection of habitat for imperiled species. In 1988, 2 fish, native to Upper Klamath Lake, the lost river sucker and the short-nosed sucker were listed as endangered.
First the sucker and then later on the salmon are listed, and that means that under biological opinions there has to be certain flows down the river and a certain level within Upper Klamath Lake. And when you put those two together in drought years, that means that there isn't enough water for irrigation.
They had to be protected. Extinction is permanent. You can compensate people for lost crops, but you cannot compensate the world for an extinct species.
Next on the Klamath Basin, a restoration for the ages. The water crisis that devastated the upper basin and the fish kill that horrified the world.
And so it really did pit the farm community against fish-dependent communities, and it was bitter and vicious.
We'll show you how all the decades of hate were channeled into a future of hope.
I'm fond of a quote from the old Israeli general Moshe Dayan. It says, if you want to make a real peace, you have to talk to your enemies, not your friends.
My name is Benola Dowd. I'm 84 years old, and I've always lived near the Klamath River. And at that time, the water was so clear, you could actually see the fish, fish swimming around. There was a cannery in Klamath Falls Cannery where all the Indian people work, and the men fished, and I used to go help my mom. I was only about 12 years old, I think, and she used to work at the cannery where they sent canned fish and sent fish all over the world. And there was jobs then from fish that came from, plentiful fish that came from the Klamath River. And we used to fish all the time, catch eels, cannelfish. Oh, I love cannelfish. Now there's no more. I don't know how they're going to doctor the river up, but I am concerned that something's got to be done.
The water crises of 2001 brought many long simmering battles in the basin to a climax. No question, there was less water to go around because of the drought. But nature's shortage was compounded by the federal government's decision to keep substantially more water in Upper Klamath Lake for the suckers and to send more down the river to the salmon.
Reclamation's core mission remains the same, but we have to, which is really to provide water and power resources in the development of that, but we have to take into account additional pieces at this point, which will be the different species needs, the ecosystem overall, fish and wildlife as well. Those all have different pieces that we have to consider.
2001, the Upper Basin Klamath Irrigation Project, which is a federal irrigation project, didn't have enough water. It was a very, very dry year, and there wasn't enough water to go around. And so the priorities had to be to protect the fish.
In 2001, the first year I was in office, the federal government decided to cut off the water to the farming community in the basin. And I made a promise to myself at that time that I was going to look for ways in which we could avoid that kind of a scenario in the future.
John Elliott was the Klamath County Commissioner in April of 2001. That's when the Bureau of Reclamation cut off the irrigation water to a huge swath of project farmland during a severe drought. Federal fisheries scientists said the water was needed in the lake and the river for sucker and salmon habitat. The backlash from that decision was palpable.
It's too important a question to be left to a rather simple question. Dams in or out. Bumper sticker slogans aren't going to work here.
Really what happens in 2001 is that this becomes a center for wider protests in the American West. There had been frustration, not just here in the Klamath Basin, but throughout the West over federal control of natural resources. The biggest protest is something called the Bucket Brigade, when water is moved from the Klamath River into the irrigation canals illegally. And it's done by local officials, it's done by every member of the community, and folks from other places as well. And if you go down to our courthouse, you'll still see a giant bucket that's a symbol of that Bucket Brigade.
The devastation of that was huge, and unfortunately, you know, the blame was put on the fish. It was put on the tribes, and it created a situation where it was us and them. It was fish versus farmer, tribes versus farmer.
That summer, more than half of the farmers in the project did not harvest a crop. In 2002, the federal government reversed their decision on the water requirements for fish, allocating less water in the river for habitat, while providing full deliveries to irrigators. Then in September, disaster struck again in the basin. It's estimated that 30,000 to 60,000 fish, mostly Chinook salmon, died near the mouth of the Klamath River. According to a report by California Fish and Game, the die-off was fueled by an unprecedented outbreak of disease, most likely aggravated by low flows.
That devastated the Hoopa people immeasurably. To see and smell dead fish, which a lot of people here regard as family and as sacred, lying dead on the banks, decomposing. You know, there was a great sadness that fell over the community. All of the river communities felt that same sadness.
You know, the fish kill is really devastating for everybody, and particularly for Indians. I mean, I think, you know, I've talked to a lot of people that there's no story that I've ever heard, a Karuk legend, that talks about a fish kill like this. I mean, these fish died before spawning. They died even before getting, for the most part, getting to Karuk territory. But so it really did pit the farm community against fish-dependent communities, and it was bitter and vicious.
The lawsuits continued. The bickering intensified. Coalitions refused to waver.
The farmers on the one hand and the tribes and the fishermen on the other can throw rocks at each other for generations and never get anything accomplished. If we want to get something accomplished, we have to realize these people have legitimate interests on the other side.
10 years ago, we just wanted to change the Endangered Species Act. We get rid of it. It's no good. It's interfering with our ability to irrigate. Practically speaking, we don't think that's going to happen. So let's say, okay, so what do we need to do? Well, how about we sit down with the people we've been fighting with over the water?
My wife and I and my son, we farm mainly potatoes, wheat, and alfalfa.
Bob Unruh's family ties to the Bureau of Reclamation's Klamath Project date back to the 30s. The project's goal was to develop irrigation by diverting water stored in Upper Klamath Lake to dry places like Malin, Oregon. With the annual rainfall average here hovering near the 13-inch mark, Rob expects to see drought years. One thing he never expected was to have the water supply to his crops cut off.
I've lived here all my life. My family got here in mid-30s. I started farming when I was 13. Raised my first crop of spuds then. I didn't go to college because I was making good money at that time. Farming was simple. You grew your crop, you worried about how much money you were going to be able to sell it for. That was farming. And now it's totally different. Well, water stability, it's really hard to explain what it's like to have a shut-off like in 2001. I've tried to run an analogy of that for a long time. Can you imagine having a business and all of a sudden you're told you got to keep operating your business, but you can't sell anything, you can't have any income? That's what a water shut-off is like to a farmer.
2005 marked a notable shift in the politics of water. The hardline stance of win-lose moved to a new spirit of compromise as stakeholders began negotiating two historic settlement agreements.
There's nothing radical in the Klamath about being an extremist. We have extremists to the political right and extremists to the political left. What's really radical is talking to the people who don't agree with you and reaching your hand across the table and working with them on a mutual problem.
On February 18, 2010, the world witnessed a modern-day truce. Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, Oregon Governor Ted Kulongoski, and more than 30 stakeholders signed 2 historic settlement agreements. These would serve as a peace accord in an epic river restoration. The Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement, or KHSA, deals with the issues leading up to the removal of the 4 dams, while the KBRA, or Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, solves water disputes and helps with fish recovery.
The Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement is the agreement that was signed that deals with all of the issues involving fisheries restoration, which is habitat and water quality and other improvements. It deals with the Water Resources Program, a number of ways to improve water efficiency, come up with ways to deal with low water years that work for the irrigation community, but also leave more water in the river for fish.
I think this is a perfect example of how the communities and the stakeholders and the interests with a direct connection to the river and direct reliance on the river have come together and really overcome the animosity and history to reach a settlement that really joins them together in a common mission and a common vision for a better future.
5 years of public and private meetings were necessary for the stakeholders to hammer out the hundreds of intricate issues in the troubled basin. One theme was prevalent: give a little, get a little.
Nobody at the table got all of what they wanted. We want dams out tomorrow. We want all the water for the fish. But I think what we come to realize is there's neighbors upstream and neighbors downstream, and there's what you want and there's what's politically achievable. And we have to have an agreement that makes the fishery sustainable and puts enough fish in the river for people to live off of that. But at the same time, we think having a compromise with people in different communities is the only sustainable solution over time.
The agreements are a way of fixing a broken system for us. The agreements are a way of ending 40 years of contentious litigation over water. The agreements give us some certainty and predictability for the future.
For Klamath Project irrigators, the KBRA caps water diversions, yet makes provisions for keeping more of the farmland producing in wetter years. From the Sprague River above Klamath Lake in Oregon, all the way to the estuary at the Pacific Ocean in California, there's overwhelming hope that the unlikeliest of allies have successfully forged an historic compromise. There's hope that salmon will once again flourish in the upper reaches of the basin. There's hope that the Klamath watershed can be restored to her full splendor in the very near future.
In the year 2020, we're going to see the landscape of a major portion of the Klamath Basin change fundamentally forever. So we will see a free-flowing river. We will see floodplains revealed for the first time in a century. We will see fish for the first time in 100 years swimming freely to their home waters.
Now we're on the cusp of the final piece of this puzzle coming together with legislation. And this bill isn't good just for Klamath County. It's not good just for Oregon. It's good for the country.
For now, we wait for the Secretary's decision. But dams in or dams out, the process of people working together here in the Klamath Basin has given rise to smarter, more sustainable ways to resolve conflicts, along with the possibility of clean, abundant water, and after a century of fighting, the very real potential for peace. Thanks for watching.
This program was funded in part by the Water Education Foundation.